So should you buy a Gen 2 Audi R8 or a Lamborghini Huracan? What are the differences, and more specifically, is the Lamborghini worth the extra money? And this is coming from the perspective of somebody that had a Huracan, then traded it for an R8, then traded it back for a Huracan. Very logical, I know. It's one thing to hear the perspective of a journalist who's driving these cars in a very carefree way, and the perspective of somebody that's actually paying for the cars, because I think that ultimately leads to a very different experience. So if you're trying to decide between these two cars, I think I have some pretty good advice to share, and the advice that I have might actually surprise you. Now, for those of you that have seen the video where I go over my entire car history, you'll know a little bit of this story, but at 23 years old, I bought a 610-4 Lamborghini Huracan, and the reason why I picked the Huracan over the R8 at that point in time is, quite frankly, I didn't even have the R8 on my radar. It didn't interest me at that point. I just really wanted to own a Lamborghini. It was a childhood dream, and I was in a financial situation where I could afford it at that time, so I decided to pull the trigger, and quite honestly, I'm pretty happy with that decision looking back. Roughly 2 years later, I ended up selling my Huracan and didn't really know what I wanted to replace it with, so as you do, I started browsing Auto Trader and I stumbled across an unclaimed, brand new 2018 Audi R8 RWS, which was the limited edition rear-wheel drive variant of the R8 that in Canada at least was basically available in a base spec, either black or white, no options whatsoever, and the price was significantly less than any of the all-wheel drive variants of the R8, either new or used. So even though the R8 wasn't really a car that interested me that much, at least for the money that it costs, because this one was so inexpensive in comparison to all the other R8s in the country, new or used, I figured it would be, at the very least, a pretty good investment, and that I could buy this car at this low price, drive it for a year or two, and then sell it for basically the same amount of money. Which is pretty much what I did. I bought the car, ended up pretty much daily driving it for 7 or 8 months, and then ended up selling it off and pulled the trigger on the car that is currently sat behind me, a Lamborghini Huracan Performante. Now, if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you're well aware that both Audi as well as Lamborghini are both owned by Volkswagen Group, and the R8 and Huracan share a lot of the same bits, which is why a lot of people think that the R8 and the Huracan are pretty much the same car. And having owned both, I can tell you that in a lot of ways they are very similar to each other, but not exactly the same. So we'll start by comparing what I think is the most important thing, and that is the driving experience. And I'll say this much: if you've spent a significant amount of time in an R8 or a significant amount of time in a Huracan, as soon as you drive the opposite car, everything will immediately feel very similar. And I'll even go as far as to say that if you're somebody that just drives for fun, and what I mean by that is you pretty much just drive on the road, you don't have really any interest in driving skill and improving that, or driving on a track or something like that, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with. These cars are ultimately pretty easy to drive depending on how you have them set up. I don't think that you would really notice a difference between the two at all in terms of how they drive. In other words, you're not going to notice a huge difference between the two until you're getting closer to the limit of what the cars are capable of. And even then, they're similar. As far as the engine and transmission is concerned, those components are identical between the two cars. So while the tunes might be a little bit different depending on which variant of the Huracan or R8 you're driving, if they all have the same tune, it ends up feeling pretty much exactly the same. Same thing goes for the sound of the engine, although I will make the argument that a stock Huracan sounds a little bit louder and a little bit better than a stock R8, but an aftermarket exhaust pretty much changes all of that anyways. In terms of speed and acceleration, the two cars both feel extremely fast. You're not going to notice a huge difference there. As far as suspension is concerned, I feel like the suspension on the R8 is a little bit better in terms of being softer in a road situation and firmer in a track situation. There's more of an extreme difference between kind of the two different spectrums of driving modes, where the Huracan in general just feels kind of stiffer across the board, definitely more harsh on the road. So in terms of just daily drivability, the Huracan feels a little bit more, I guess, compliant in that regard. And then as far as steering is concerned, Lamborghini, you can option it in, but most of them have Lamborghini dynamic steering, it's called, which basically changes the weight of the steering depending on speed. And I'm not sure if the R8 has something similar to that. I know my R8 RWS did not have anything like that at all. So the steering in general just felt a little bit lighter. It felt a little bit more consistent. I've never been a huge fan of the LDS system in the Huracan. So in that regard, again, I kind of prefer the R8 in terms of just how it feels at the wheel. The Huracan Performante, however, and this is where I'm going to defend myself a little bit, does feel different from the regular Huracan and the regular R8 V10 Plus, given that you've spent significant time in either of those two cars. Like I said, if you're a little bit of a noob when it comes to cars like this, you're not going to have a better experience in a Performante versus an R8 or a regular Huracan, in my opinion. They're going to feel very similar to you. But again, if you're familiar with the cars and you're into, I guess, the very minute details in terms of how it handles, and you have some of the ability to extract some of that extra performance, I think you'll appreciate what the Performante offers versus the regular variant of the Huracan, or of course the R8. As for the refresh of the Gen 2 R8 or the Huracan Evo, which are kind of the latest variations of both of those cars, I've not driven either of them, so I can't really comment on how those compare or perform versus the older variants that, of course, I've talked about in this video so far. But I have to believe, at least with the Huracan Evo, because it does add in rear wheel steer, that would have a pretty significant impact in terms of how that car handles and drives in general. So I'd be curious to try one out. But as far as if it's significantly better or not, that I can't really comment on. So to summarize, especially if you're only going to be driving this car on the road, performance between all of them is pretty much a wash. Although I'll say this much, and this is kind of a personal preference thing, I really enjoyed my R8 because of the fact that it was rear-wheel drive. And as much as I love the all-wheel drive system on the Performante, if I were to ever buy another R8 or another Huracan, I would definitely be looking at a rear-wheel drive variant, just because I find that to be a little bit more fun. It's not necessarily better, but again, it depends on what you're looking for from a driving experience. Next, let's talk about comfort and practicality, which is not why you buy cars like this, but that's where I think there's some huge separation between the Huracan and the R8, where the R8 as a daily driver, which I did drive that car 4 to 5 times a week, same as I did with my Huracan 610-4. Haven't really done that as much with the Performante because I have 2 other cars to drive. But if you want to use the car as a daily driver, I'll tell you straight up right now, the Audi R8 is significantly better. First things first, getting in and out of the R8 versus the Huracan is just easier. There's no way around that. The seats, if you get the comfort seats in the Huracan versus any of the seat variants in the R8 seats just feel better in my opinion, and they're a heck of a lot more comfortable. I don't know why, because they seem like they're very similar, but for whatever reason, the R8 is much more comfortable in that regard. As far as infotainment is concerned, actually using all of the tech in your brand new supercar, it's just so much better in the R8. I don't want to say that it's perfect, because it's still a little bit of a pain to use in my opinion, but compared to the Huracan, it is a night and day difference. You'll have a much more, I guess, pleasurable, that sounds stupid. You'll be less annoyed by the infotainment system in the R8. For those of you that saw the video where I shared the 5 or 6 things that I really find annoying about my Lamborghini, you would have heard my epic rant on the cup holder, which is absolutely terrible. And a lot of you guys argued that a water bottle does not count as a cup. I'm not sure which world that you're living in, but I feel like it's not unreasonable to expect a cup holder of any sort to hold a regular sized water bottle. That's besides the point. On the R8 versus the Huracan, not only do you get 2 cup holders rather than 1, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going off of memory here, but the cup holders that you do get are in a spot that makes a lot more sense. It's easier to access your cup, and you don't have to worry about your cup flying through the car once you put it in the cup holder, which for me, if you're going to be daily driving the car especially, that is a feature that very much matters. Also, internal storage space. Not only does the R8 actually have a spot to put your key, which is great because I don't like having my key in my pocket. It tends to fly out, go in the crack of the seat, and then it takes like 10 minutes to fish it out. I don't like doing that. There's nowhere to put the key in the Huracan for whatever reason. Also, the front lift. This is a really big one in terms of just overall convenience and I guess the stress that comes along with driving a supercar. With a Lamborghini, whether it's a Huracan, Performante, it doesn't matter what variant it is, it's probably going to come spec'd with a front lift. And as I've showed you, again in that previous video, it's very, very slow. It takes forever to go all the way up. So by the time you need it, it might be too late, or you're going to have to completely stop traffic to give your car 15 seconds to raise up so you don't scrape your bumper or potentially even tear it off. With the R8, because of its design, it just has a shorter nose in general. The approach angle is significantly better, and it does not need or have a front lift. I drove around that R8 for 7 or 8 months, pretty much every single day, never scraped on a single thing, never even came close. The fact that I did not need a front lift on a car that is effectively very similar as a Huracan is extremely convenient and something that I really appreciated about that car versus this one. I'm not sure if I mentioned headroom, but if I didn't, obviously the slightly taller roof and different shape of the R8 means that there's more headroom inside the car. Not to say that the Huracan is lacking in headroom, but again, when you're comparing the two, there's more space for the driver as well as the passenger inside the R8. I'll also touch on trunk space because obviously these are both rear mid-engine cars, which means that you have the front trunk or frunk. I don't think that there's much of a difference between the two in trunk space. If there is, it's so small of a difference you're not going to notice. There's very little space in general, but I will say that I much prefer the design of the actual trunk lid on the Huracan versus the R8, just because it's a little bit smaller, and for whatever reason, the one on the R8, the way that it clips in, you have to press it in and it clicks, it's very difficult to tell whether or not it's fully clicked in, especially when you first get it. So it's not as, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, it doesn't matter. It's a stupid point anyways. So from a comfort and convenience standpoint, the R8 is just significantly better than any variant of the Huracan. I don't care what anybody says. But then here's the big one, and I think most people would agree with me. The difference in, I guess, prestige between an R8 and not just a Huracan, but a Lamborghini of any kind just isn't the same thing. And this is something that's a big part of the overall ownership experience of both of these two cars, because while an Audi R8 is a super cool car, it's a lot of people's dream cars, and it definitely gets looks out on the road and in parking lots and stuff like that. A Lamborghini, whether it's a Huracan or any other Lamborghini, is a Lamborghini. It is instantly recognizable by absolutely everybody. And even if you have the nicest R8 in the world, if a Lamborghini is parked next to it and it's in horrible condition, all of the paint is falling off, it's literally a piece of crap that barely made its way there, people are just going to flock to that Lamborghini because it's a Lamborghini. Car people know the difference and or lack thereof, especially when you're comparing a Huracan and an R8, but the vast majority of people, they see an Audi and they see a Lamborghini, and I think you can pretty much figure out which one they're gonna be more interested in. And I don't want this to sound wrong, because I think that there are some people that would hear what I just said and assume that you're only buying the car to be seen in the car, and that's not necessarily the case. But if you have driven both of these cars, you will notice that there is a distinct difference in terms of how people react and respond to the car. Because regardless of which one you choose, it's going to draw more attention than a Toyota Prius as an example. But the type of attention and amount of attention is definitely something that is noticeably different between the two. And depending on your personality, this could be a good or bad thing. I'll use myself as an example. I just went to put gas in this car, which is why it's 1,000 degrees in this garage and I'm sweating like crazy. But as I was pumping gas, someone pulls up right next to me in an empty gas station, rolls their window down, and asks me if my car was a rental. That's something that I did not experience one time driving around in an R8, but that's the type of attention you're going to get with a Huracan. For whatever reason, especially if you're a little bit younger, people will assume it's not yours, where in the case of an R8, I guess it's just more believable that somebody a little bit younger could afford something like that. So again, it's just a different type of attention. When it comes to servicing and maintenance, because the two cars are so similar to each other in terms of components that have to do with performance, the maintenance is pretty much identical. However, if you're somebody that likes to get your car maintained at an actual dealer, you're going to find that it is significantly more expensive to have your car serviced at the Lamborghini dealer versus having it serviced at the Audi dealer. Prices on that kind of thing, even though they shouldn't, do vary from dealer to dealer, but as a general rule of thumb, I think you could expect to pay roughly twice as much for a servicing at a Lamborghini dealer as you would at an Audi dealer. And if you try to do what I did, which is take your Lamborghini Huracan to the Audi dealer to have them service it for a lower price, they won't touch your car. I tried. And then as far as things like brakes and tires, they pretty much use the exact same components. It's all higher end stuff, so obviously it's going to be expensive. That more or less comes with the territory. And as far as gas mileage, is concerned, for those that will ask, kind of a dumb question. It's the same regardless of which one you go for. And then there's the emotional side of comparing these two cars, where I will say that the Audi R8, because it's so refined, because it's so comfortable, because everything in the car for the most part tends to make sense, you can catch yourself cruising on the highway at a steady speed and you almost forget that you're inside of a V10 rear mid-engine supercar, where in a Huracan, I feel like that happens a lot less often, just because the view from inside the car is so dramatic and so different from any other car because of the crazy rake of the windshield. You're always a little bit uncomfortable. You're always a little bit inconvenienced because not everything in the car makes sense. And that's part of the experience. You could say that that's terrible and I don't want that. And if that's the case, then you'll probably enjoy the R8 a lot more. But if you want an experience from a car that truly feels different from every other car, I think that the Lamborghini does that better than the R8 does. And then finally, there's the price. Regardless of whether it's new or used, the Lamborghini is more expensive than the R8. And I think if money is no option, if you can afford both of these cars comfortably, and you're trying to choose between them, I think the more special experience in any variant is going to be the Huracan. It's more dramatic, it's a little bit cooler, I would argue, and it does certain things that the R8 just doesn't do from an emotional standpoint. And that's an aspect of cars that I think is very much overlooked when it comes to modern cars, because people are so wrapped up in stats. And statistically, these two cars are very similar to each other, but the emotional aspect, the specialness of the experience, if you will, I would argue is better in the Huracan. With that said, if you're just looking for the best daily driver variant of the R8 or the Huracan, which are effectively the same platform, the R8 is much better as a daily driver. If I were to replace my AMG GTR, which I am currently using as a tripod, and I wanted a daily driver that happened to have a V10 mid-engine layout, I would probably buy an R8 before I bought a Huracan, just because, again, it's way more usable and still gives you that crazy performance, the crazy sound, and really what makes that platform so good in the first place. Whether or not the Lamborghini is worth the extra money, however, I think that depends on your specific situation. If this is going to be your very first supercar, if you don't necessarily have your heart set on a Lamborghini and you're going to be just as happy with that R8, if it makes you just as excited, I think that the driving experience and enjoyment you're going to get out of that car is worth the savings that you're going to get by buying that R8 over the Huracan, especially some of the prices that I've seen on used R8 V10s or V10 Pluses. It's really good value for money, where the Huracan, even the used 2015s and 2016s, there's still quite a bit more money. And then when you're talking about the refresh of the R8 and the Evos, I think that they're priced at such a point now where they're almost not worth it. They're both very cool cars, but I don't think that personally I would spend the money on them, because I don't think that the experience is going to be that much better to justify paying nearly $100,000 more, whether you go for the R8 or the Huracan, which it's a lot of money. The prices on these cars have actually gone up quite significantly since they've done these refreshes. So if you're just after the best possible supercar experience, a rear mid-engine V10 car, and you want to spend the least amount of money possible, I would probably buy an R8 before I bought a Lamborghini. So I'll end the video on this note. If you really are trying to decide between an R8 and the Huracan, I would strongly recommend getting to a dealer and driving both of them so you can feel the difference for yourself. Again, if you don't really have much in the way of experience between these two cars, I think that they will end up feeling pretty similar. But at the same time, everybody notices something different. Everybody values something different in any given car. So what I like, you might find to be completely not what you want whatsoever. So again, everyone has their preferences when it comes to this kind of thing. And if you're going to be spending that much money, regardless of whether it's an R8 or a Huracan, because they're both expensive cars at the end of the day, go test them out and get exactly what you want. Anyways, guys, that's it for this one. Thank God, because I am sweating like crazy. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to support it with a like. If you have any questions regarding these two cars or other video ideas you'd like to see on the channel, leave all of that down below in the comments and I'll do my best to get an answer out to you. Also, if you're not subscribed to the channel already and don't want to miss out on weekly car videos, I don't even know what the next video is going to be about, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you get notified when the next new video goes live. You can find all of my social media information, mainly my Instagram, down below in the description as well. And other than that, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.